Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something a lot of you have been asking about managing chronic illness, like a pro.
And we've got a pretty impressive stack of material here: articles, forum posts, personal notes.
Yeah, some of you even sent in voice memos. So we're going to help you make sense of it all.
Hopefully, find those gems that really make a difference in your life.
Exactly. One of the things that really struck me, especially from that Living with Resilience podcast episode, is this idea of medication as just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's not the whole picture, is it?
No, not at all. It seems like a lot of you are really thinking about things like diet, exercise.
Even just the emotional toll chronic illness can take.
Totally. And that's something the podcast touched on too, how important it is to look beyond just the medical side of things.
It's really about building a whole lifestyle that supports your well-being.
Building resilience, right? Yeah.
Exactly. It's like creating the support system for yourself, and the podcast breaks it down into these key areas: diet, exercise, mental health, sleep, social support. It's a lot to juggle.
I know, right? But even just having those categories could be helpful.
Yeah, it gives you a framework to think about things.
One thing that jumped out from the forum posts was this sense of isolation that a lot of people feel.
Yeah, makes sense. Chronic illness can be so unpredictable.
One day you feel okay, the next you're completely wiped out.
And that unpredictability can make it hard to connect with people, to make plans.
Definitely. Makes it hard to feel like you have a normal life sometimes.
And I think that's why having a solid support system is so crucial.
It's not just about practical help, is it? It's about feeling understood.
Yeah, knowing you're not alone in this
The podcast hosts actually recommend looking into online communities.
seems like a great way to connect with people who really get it, especially if it's hard to find that in person.
You know, one of the things I'm excited to dive into is diet.
Oh, yeah, you had a ton of research on that, didn't you?
I did. It's fascinating how food can be such a powerful tool.
Totally. And it's not just about what you shouldn't eat.
Right. Like you had all those notes about gut bacteria and
Yeah.
the connection between what we eat and how our bodies respond to chronic illness.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
it really is. You even had a question about anti-inflammatory diets.
Oh, yeah. Do they really work?
And the podcast dives into that, talks about how things like leafy greens, berries, fatty fish can actually help reduce inflammation in the body.
Makes you think about food in a whole new way, doesn't it?
It does. And when I was reading through your notes, you mentioned noticing a difference in how you felt after eating certain foods.
I did. It's like my body was trying to tell me something.
It's like giving you clues. And maybe this dietary approach is a way to work with your body, not against it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Work with your body, not against it.
Now, I know when we talked about exercise before, you had some questions.
Yeah, I think I even wrote seriously
Mm.
in my notes.
Uh-huh. Saw that. It can feel like a lot, right? Working out when you're dealing with chronic illness. Totally. But what's interesting is that the podcast and some of the research you found actually suggests that gentle, consistent exercise can make a big difference.
Okay, so not running a marathon or anything.
No, not at all. It's more about finding movement that feels good for you, working with your energy levels, not pushing past them.
You know, you mentioned in your notes that even short walks sometimes wipe you out.
Yeah, that's something the podcast addresses too. It's about respecting your limits.
Because I think a lot of people have that experience, right? You push yourself too hard, and then you pay for it later.
Absolutely. And the thing is, exercise can actually reduce certain symptoms over time.
Really?
Like you were saying, you've been so frustrated with fatigue. Well, there's research suggesting that regular, moderate exercise can actually improve energy levels.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it's like you're training your body to be more resilient.
Interesting. So what kind of exercise are we talking about here?
Well, the podcast gives some great examples: walking, yoga, swimming, and you even circled swimming in your notes.
I did. I used to love swimming. Maybe I should try that again.
It's definitely worth exploring, and I think the key is finding something enjoyable. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
Right. Like you mentioned wanting to get back into gardening. Maybe that could be a way to move your body and connect with nature at the same time.
Absolutely. And speaking of connecting, the podcast also talks about rest and stress management. These are so crucial when it comes to managing chronic illness.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You know, it's interesting because you highlighted a section in one of the forum threads where people were talking about how stress seems to make their symptoms worse.
Makes total sense, doesn't it?
It does, and the podcast talks about that too, how stress can actually trigger inflammation in the body.
It's like this vicious cycle. You're stressed about your symptoms, which then makes them worse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So finding healthy ways to manage stress becomes super important.
For sure. And the podcast mentions things like meditation, mindfulness, deep breathing, even spending time in nature, which ties back to your gardening idea.
It all comes full circle. It's funny because you were a bit skeptical about meditation before, but you underlined some key points in that mindfulness article.
Yeah, I think reading about the actual science behind it, how it impacts the nervous system, that made it feel less, I don't know, woo-woo, and more like a practical tool.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the podcast guests really seem to emphasize the practical side of things.
Yeah, which I appreciate.
They even talk about how therapy can play a huge role in managing the emotional side of things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, you mentioned feeling overwhelmed by it all in your notes, and therapy can be so helpful for processing those feelings and developing coping strategies.
And they specifically mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, as being really effective for folks dealing with chronic illness,
Right. It's all about identifying and changing negative thought patterns.
which can be so helpful when you're constantly facing challenges.
Absolutely. And you even flagged a section in one of the articles about how CBT can help with pain management.
Oh, yeah, because pain has been a big concern for me lately.
Yeah. And speaking of concerns, you highlighted a section in one of the forum posts about navigating the healthcare system.
Ugh, don't even get me started. It can be so frustrating.
I know, right? It's
Yeah.
like you have to become your own advocate just to get your needs met.
Exactly. And I bet a lot of our listeners can relate to that.
Absolutely. And the podcast talks about that too, the importance of finding a doctor who really listens to you and respects your experience.
Yeah, that doctor-patient relationship is so key,
You want someone who sees you as a partner in your own care.
not just a list of symptoms, right?
Exactly. It's about feeling heard and understood, not dismissed or rushed.
And sometimes that takes time and effort to find the right fit. It's interesting how the podcast emphasizes self-compassion.
Yeah, for sure.
It's so easy to get caught up in feeling like you're not doing enough.
Yeah, or like you're failing somehow just because you're dealing with a chronic illness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when I was reading through your notes, it seemed like that was something you were grappling with too.
Oh, definitely. I think it's a really common experience.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the podcast hosts do a great job of reminding us that it's okay to have bad days.
Yeah, to have setbacks.
It's not about being perfect.
Not at all. It's about progress, not perfection.
Absolutely. And that really resonates with what you were saying in your notes about feeling like you're constantly 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, tell me about it. It's a journey, not a sprint.
It really is, and it's a journey you don't have to take alone.
Right. And that reminded me of that forum post you flagged where someone was talking about joining an online support group.
Oh, yeah, they were a little hesitant at first, weren't they?
Yeah. But they ended up finding it incredibly helpful.
Yeah, it was like they found a whole community of people who truly understood what they were going through.
Yeah. And they even got some great tips for managing their symptoms and advocating for themselves with doctors.
It's a good reminder that even though chronic illness can be isolating, you don't have to go through it alone.
For sure. And, you mentioned in your notes that you were considering joining a support group, but felt a little nervous about it,
I think a lot of people feel that way. It can be intimidating to put yourself out there.
especially when you're dealing with something so personal, right?
Absolutely. But remember, these communities are full of people who have been there.
Yeah, who get it.
They can offer a wealth of support, advice, and even just a sense of belonging.
Yeah, just knowing you're not alone can make a huge difference.
Totally. So maybe dipping your toes in, even just reading some posts or comments could be a good starting point.
It's a good first step.
You never know. You might find a community that feels like a safe haven.
Yeah, a place where you can share your experiences, ask questions, and connect with others who truly understand.
Exactly. And speaking of understanding, I think we've done a pretty thorough job of unpacking all those sources you sent over.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today.
The emotional and mental aspects, diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, therapy, navigating the healthcare system, the power of community.
Phew, that's a lot. Hopefully you're walking away from this deep dive feeling more informed, more empowered, and less alone on this journey.
Absolutely. Remember, managing chronic illness is a marathon, not a sprint.
Be kind to yourself, celebrate your successes, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it.
You got this.
And one last thing, I want to leave you with a question that really stuck with me from the podcast. Knowing all of this, what's one small change you can make today to improve your well-being?
It could be anything, really.
Trying a new relaxation technique, experimenting with a new recipe, reaching out to a friend, or even just taking 5 minutes for yourself to just breathe.
Every step you take, no matter how small, is a step in the right direction.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and remember, you're not alone. Take care.